Good morning, friends. My name is Jeff Pelly, and I'm an educational consultant with Blast IU17, and I would like to welcome you all back to the third segment in our IEP Best Practice series. And this time we're going to focus on the process of secondary transition. If you have been with us before, awesome. If not, we want to make sure that you follow these links here. This is a series that we did on present levels. This one here is a series that we did on measurable annual goals. You can pause this video and jot that link down and it will lead you to those other two sections that we did. But this time around, we're going to focus on secondary transition, specifically on the invitation, who you need to invite to an IEP meeting if a student is of transition age. We're also going to focus on what we call the transition section and their present levels, and also the transition grid, which is right after those present levels. And I'm so happy that you joined us today. So we're going to just start with a quick review, and we talk about IEPs during our IEP Best Practice series here. And we have to remember that an IEP is that legally binding document that's essentially between the school district and the student's family, and it's kind of in together there. They're making sure that we're going into this contract there. It's 1 year valid to make sure that that student is going to make some progress related to their unique needs. We can review this document a little bit more than annually. Anytime either the school district or the family can say that they want to do a review and revision, but generally it's good for 1 year. The IEP has several sections here. We start off with our dates and demographics, then we go to special considerations, our present levels, transition, which we're going to focus on today, assessment piece, goals and objectives, special education related services, aids and services, and also modifications, placement, and then of course pen data reporting. We talked about present levels 2 sessions ago, and the present levels describe and summarize exactly what that kiddo is currently doing in their educational program. It provides a baseline for writing these measurable annual goals. And when we talk about transition, which we're going to speak about in a few moments, that starts at age 14. Basically, those present levels set the precedent for what's going on. And once we're age 14, we have to start shifting that IEP towards secondary transition. The present levels include academic achievement. They also include functional performance, transition, which we're going to talk about here in a few moments. If there are any parental concerns, how that kiddo's disability is going to affect their involvement with both the general education classroom and also the general education curriculum. We also focus on the strengths in those present levels and also any academic and developmental needs. Those needs are what drive your measurable annual goals, and we come up with those needs by making awesome present levels. The present levels also talk about what the student can do well, and again, we just talked about those developmental and academic needs. Why are we here? We're here to focus on those needs, and we're here to get those needs met with measurable annual goals. We also want to make sure that we always have a baseline with those measurable annual goals in the present levels. And moving forward with those measurable annual goals, we want to make sure that we understand that these are designed to meet that student's individual need based on what we wrote in those present levels. The annual goals have to be something that the student can generally meet within 1 year's time. We have to have what we consider reasonable expectations. These annual goals may have short-term objectives. For any student that takes the Pennsylvania Alternative Assessment, the PASA, we need to have short-term objectives. But for other students, if you decide to have a short-term objective, you certainly can. And those objectives are just a roadmap for how we're going to meet that measurable annual goal. Considering more on measurable annual goals, they're going to build skills that we identified in those needs. They should be prioritized. We shouldn't have 10 or 12 goals for every student. 3 to 5 is generally a good idea. We, again, want to make sure that we can accomplish this usually in 1 year's time. We're going to begin from that baseline that we identified in those present levels. And we have to make sure that whatever we're asking that student to do is something that we can observe. It has to be observable behavior. That way we can take data and progress, monitor it. We also have to remember the most important piece when we're writing an IEP, it needs to be individualized. I love this graphic here that talks about all the different colors of the rainbows because we're all different, we're all unique, and that goes the same with our students. So those cookie cutter IEPs, we certainly do not want to have those. We may have some cookie cutter statements in each student's IEPs, but we have to remember that every IEP should be individualized. And now we're going to jump into the best practice piece where we're going to talk about secondary transition. And first and foremost, we got to find out what secondary transition is. And the way IDEA defines that, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, they say it's a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability that is designed within a results-oriented process. It's focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate what that kid is going to do from school into post-school, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated deployment, continuing adult education, adult services, or what we consider independent living. I like to generally say education and training, employment, independent living. Those are the big three areas that we're going to focus on with secondary transition. Planning for secondary transition occurs in the state of Pennsylvania at age 14. If that IEP, the student is going to turn 14 within the duration of that IEP, so the student might be 13, but in 3 months' time they're going to turn 14, we still have to address secondary transition within that student's IEP. Many other states in the United States don't start transition until the age of 16, but in Pennsylvania we start at age 14. And again, we want to make sure that if that student is going to turn 14 within the IEP's duration, that we consider secondary transition. So what do we actually put into that transition section there? Well, it's going to have those post-secondary goals, as I spoke about, education and training, employment, and independent living. We need to take a look at those goals every single year. We need to update those. Are they going to stay the same? Are they going to change? And we also need to make sure that we're going to have assessments. The way we get to those goals is by having proper assessments for transition. We also have to have courses of study that's going to be in the transition grid. And we also have something called a service. A service is essentially a measurable annual goal that's tied into that secondary transition grid, which we're going to speak about in a few moments there. We also want to make sure that that student is invited to the IEP, that we have evidence that they're invited there. And we want to make sure that we have participation from agencies. The way the law reads, if appropriate, evidence that agencies who are likely to provide and pay for services were invited. We generally want to invite an agency to every single IEP for where the student is age 14 or older. So the transition assessment piece, that's a process of gathering relevant information to plan, evaluate, or make decisions. We can get this information from a multitude of sources over a period of time. And remember, this is not going to look the same for all students. If we have a student that's on a college track, their assessments might be more apt to focus on that. Whereas if we have a student that's just going to do some community participation and not go on to competitive integrated employment, their assessment should also follow that track as well. So the purpose of assessment, again, going back to what we spoke about a few slides ago, that is how we actually formulate our post-secondary goals. We can't just pull those goals out of the thin air. We have to have assessment. The same with our measurable annual goals that we talked about in our last series. It's the same with our transition goals. We have to have what I call some meat and potatoes behind those assessments. So the transition assessment taken a step further, we need to make sure that we include that in the transition present levels. And we always need to list the date and the name of the assessment. Then we can talk about the data. And the state of Pennsylvania always likes us to go at least back 2 years. So the same for last year's assessment. If it's the student's 14th year and they're only going to have transition for the first time, you can put that in the transition section. This is the student's first year of transition services. But for every year after that, we always want to list the current assessment that we gave and then last year's assessment information. It's very important to document that. Transition, we like to say, is a process. It evolves over time. So we need to see how these goals are going to grow, and the same with the assessment piece. So when we take a step further with assessment, we do have these assessments that we actually give to students, but we can also take information by interviewing the students, doing a survey with the student, just having observations with the student, and we can also take into consideration from parents and other team members. You know, we always want to make sure that we're polling our parents, especially for our students who might have some more cognitive delays. We're really going to rely on that team approach for how we assess and how we get that transition plan going there. And if our students are also going out and doing some paid work experience, some job shadows through some agencies or through the Office of Vocation and Rehabilitation, those are always going to be important, and we want to make sure that we're checking out what that looks like there and putting all of that data into the transition section. That all revolves around transition assessment. This slide here, you can pause the video. This gives you some great examples of some assessments if you're looking for some assessments. I'm also going to have some supported resources here at the end where you can get some other assessment information, but sites like the Pennsylvania Career Zone, the Bridges Interest Inventory, ONET, the Ability Profile, those are all free ones there that really, really work out, and you want to make sure that you're giving a different assessment every year to that student. Last year, if we gave the Apple assessment, this year we want to make sure we give the orange assessment. We have to show that those are different, and these are some great sites for you to get some information on different assessments that you can give your students. I also want to point your attention to NTAC. NTAC is a fantastic resource. That's the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. And the state of Pennsylvania has PATN, our Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, and PATN gets a lot of their information from NTAC. And one of the great resources that NTAC put together is this age-appropriate transition assessment toolkit. If you just put into Google the NTAC Transition Assessment Toolkit, that's going to pop up and you'll be able to download it. It has a wealth of information. If you're stuck on assessments and you don't know which ones to use, go ahead and Google this and download that. That'll give you some great resources. And at the end of the presentation, I also give you my contact information. I invite you to send me an email if you're stuck and you need some information about assessments. I'd be happy to reach out and help you. So when we're talking about the transition section, I spoke about it a few slides ago, but we're talking about post-secondary goals: education and training, employment, and independent living. And education and training does not necessarily mean that that student needs to go on to college or a technical school. They can get what we call on-the-job training. That's going to be available to those students as well. Employment is just that, the student going out and obtaining a job, and independent living is how close that student's going to be to living independently. They can still live as independent as possible with supports from their family and their community, but we're going to make sure that we're documenting all three for all of our students who are of transition age. Then we're going to talk about the actual IEP invite and the team when a student becomes transition age. So the required members that need to be listed on that IEP invitation and part of the actual IEP team when a student is age 14 or older is, of course, our LEA, that's the local education agency representative. We need a general education teacher and a special education teacher. There are some times where the general education teacher is waived, they're not needed, their input isn't going to be discussed. That's fine, just make sure that you have a waiver signed from the parents there. And speaking of the parents, we always want to make sure that we're inviting our parents or our guardians. And then very, very important, once that student is of transition age, if they're turning 13 and going to be 14 during the duration of the IEP, or if they're age 14 or older, they have to be invited to this IEP meeting. So crucial that they're going to be there. After all, this is their life. We want to make sure that we're talking about them, so we need to have them at the table. We also want to make sure that we're inviting our community and agency representatives. We're going to talk about that in a few moments here of what that actually looked like. And if the student is attending a career and technical education center, many schools have their own. Other schools have different buildings where they send their students. But if CTE, if the student attends that program, or if it's going to be considered, we need to make sure that that individual who runs that program or representative from that program is invited to the actual IEP meeting as well. And then we have other members that are not required, but they can be considered: the transition coordinator at the school district, a school psychologist, a guidance counselor, any type of instructional support staff, job coaches, all of those folks there. They're all more than welcome to be invited. But again, this side of the actual slide are the folks that we want to make sure that we have invited. So when we talk about a community agency representative, that's somebody from an outside agency, typically the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, the Mental Health or Intellectual Disability Office. Those individuals need to be listed on the actual IEP invitation. It's okay if they don't come, but we have to document the fact that they were invited. It's so crucial that we invite those agencies there. This slide here gives you some examples of different agencies that could be involved. Again, in our region here, within IU17's borders, we have wonderful support from the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. If a student has some mental health concerns, or if that student is intellectually disabled or has a developmental disability, those individuals can be invited as well. If you're ever confused about who to invite, again, use the contact information at the end of this presentation. I will be happy to help you for who you need to be invited to these meetings. And again, so crucial, the agency does not have to come to the meeting, but we have to document the fact that they were invited. And we're talking about career and technical representative. Again, I spoke about it a few slides ago. If the student is attending a CTE, or if we're considering it, we want to make sure that that representation individual is listed on the actual IEP invitation. So crucial there again that that individual is invited. We're also going to talk about that invitation, and it has to have the parent involved and actually the student involved as well. We're going to look at what that invitation actually looks like in a few slides here. We're going to see that those individuals are actually listed. You want to make sure that we're also correctly checking the boxes that are on the actual IEP invite, and again, that that agency is invited. So let's take a look at what that IEP invitation actually looks like. And this is an example of what IU17 uses with our DART system here, but there are two boxes, transition planning and also transition services. Anytime that student is 14 or 13 and turning 14, we always want to make sure that we're checking these two boxes here, because at every single IEP for a transition age student, we're going to talk about transition, okay? The transition planning piece and also the transition services. When you check this box for transition services, we also want to make sure that we list what agencies are actually being invited. So for this student, we have the Mental Health Intellectual Disability Agency and also the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. Not only is the box checked, but we also listed exactly what agencies were listed as well. We have to make sure we do that. And then taking it a step further, this would be what the actual form looks like if we went down a little bit. We actually have the student listed, the parent listed. A couple of slides ago, we talked about how crucial it is for the student to be invited as well as the parent. Make sure that they're listed as well. Special education, regular education, we talked about the LEA. This individual has some speech support. And then here are our pieces here. The community agency rep, that would be the MHID folks. And actually the vocational rehabilitation council, that would be OVR. Again, so crucial that these folks are invited. It's okay if they're not able to attend, but we have to document attendance. And how we do it is on the actual IEP invitation. So now we're going to jump into the transition present levels here. And we want to make sure that we're talking about the transition section. So in our present levels, we learned that we have our present levels of academic achievement. We also have our present levels of functional performance. And then after that, we have our transition section, our present levels for transition. And in that transition section, we're going to have a whole wealth of information. And we're going to give you an example of what this actually looks like in the IEP. But prior to that, let's take a look. We're going to have the name and the date and the summary of the current transition assessment. Remember, we want to have this year's assessment. We also want to go back and list last year's assessment information as well. In that transition assessment, we're going to talk about the student's interests, their preference, their abilities, their aptitude. All of those things need to be talked about in the actual transition assessment. So also in that transition assessment, the transition section, you're going to list assessment information from this year, assessment information for last year, and then you're going to list our three post-secondary goals: education and training, employment, and independent living. These are the same goals that are going to be listed next in our transition grid. We also want to have a sentence or two in there talking about if those goals remain the same or if they've changed from last year. The way I always like to do it is, here's Jeff's information from this year's assessment, here's Jeff's information from last year's assessment. Taking all of this information into consideration, we came up with these three goals: education and training, employment, independent living. List those goals exactly how they're written, and then you can have a sentence there: these goals remain the same from last year, or Jeff's interests have expanded and his goals have changed from last year. We want to document that we considered, are they staying the same or are they moving? And then taking a step further, we always want to make sure that we understand that our post-secondary goals are just that. They're occurring after high school graduation. So these goals can't be Jeff is going to attend a CTE program within his high school. It has to be Jeff is going to look for employment in the field of welding after high school graduation. They have to occur after high school graduation. We want to see that language in the actual present levels there. So when we're talking about unrealistic goals, I always like to say we never want to be dream crushers in the area of secondary transition. It's not our job to say, you can't attend Harvard because you're in a life skills classroom. It's our job to say, you know what, maybe Harvard isn't in your future, because we want to make sure that we're using assessment to show the student that you're not taking college level courses. You're still going to do awesome things within your next phase of life here, but let's use assessment and say, this is why we're not going to be able to do that. Same thing if we had a student that had an unrealistic goal, say that they wanted to be a NASCAR driver, you know? Well, you know what? We're not going to be able to get to NASCAR because in order to do NASCAR, you have to be able to do this, this, and this, okay? But we might not be able to get to the NASCAR driver, but we might be able to work in an auto parts store. We might be able to help other individuals select things in the auto parts section of a Walmart or a Target, something like that. we have to be realistic with these goals. It's our job to set these students up for success. And when we have an unrealistic goal, we really need to break that goal down and show the students that this is the steps that it's going to take. And right now we're not on that path, and that's okay. But let's take a different path and get you close to what you're going to be able to do. And if you have any questions with what unrealistic goals look like, I really invite you to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to make sure that we talk about that. We never want to put in the IEP, this student can't attend this program because of their disability. That's not a reason why. We have to use data to show us why the student couldn't, get to a typical transition goal there. We really want to make sure that we're documenting this at all times, and just put that information in the IEP. Let the assessments lead the student to what they're actually going to be able to do with secondary transition. All right, so if we're talking about education and training, we want to make sure that we list some examples here, so you can pause the slides and get some examples. This is always occurring. You'll see this statement here: after high school graduation, after high school graduation, after high school graduation. We always want to make sure we're listing that. So just to read a couple of them here: Brian plans to attend a 2-year technical program after high school graduation. Latoya's goal is to attend a 4-year college to pursue her interest in working with persons with hearing loss after high school graduation. These are all occurring once that student graduates, and we have that language in there for education and training. Taking it a step further, this is going to focus on our employment goals, and we have a couple examples here. Jesse has a goal of working in the travel industry after high school graduation. Steve plans to seek competitive employment, possibly in the trucking industry after high school graduation. And this one here, if the student was going to go on for some further education after high school graduation and completion of a collegiate program, Andre plans to seek employment in video production, again, after high school graduation. And the last one here, we have independent living. This is when a student is going to go on and live as independent as possible. And we're going to say that Caroline is, her goal is to live independently after high school graduation. And then we can talk about our friend Zach. Zach's goal is to live with his family after high school graduation. He would need supports to access community services. We have to make sure that we document that there, okay? This is an area in the actual transition section where the IEP team might decide that the student might not need a goal, okay? We always want to consider education and training, employment, and independent living, but there are rare cases where a student might not need a goal, say for independent living. They have skills that are all wrapped up and they might not need any supports. So if you're going to have a student where the IEP team decides that you're not going to have to goal, you have to make sure that you're going to base this on data. So an example of this would be Jeff's goal is to live on his own once he has established employment after high school graduation. Based on data, the IEP team has determined that the goal and services for the independent living area are not needed at this time. It's okay if you decide as a team that you're not going to list a goal, but what you need to do is back that up with data. You have to make sure that you have the data in there. So stating that the student has age-appropriate skills, that's not sufficient enough. We need to give that student assessments and saying, you know what, we're going to make sure that this student does not need a goal, and the reason why is based on this, this, and this. Now, in my personal opinion, as a best practice, I feel it's always a best practice to give each student a goal in this area: education and training, employment, independent living. The joke I like to make is I am 43 years old and my father still supports me when I do my taxes. I don't know how to do my taxes. I could have a goal in that area there, you know? We could argue that I'm married, I have children, I have a wife, but I still need some support with independent living, so we could still give me a goal. And I like to say it's the same with our students there. The goal could always be, Jeff plans to live independently upon high school graduation. But if we do the adverse and say that Jeff does not need a goal, then we're going to have some rock solid data behind that, and you're going to need a whole lot of data to back that up. So again, the personal recommendation is to make sure you always have those 3 goals. The professional recommendation is if the team decides that we don't need a goal, you have to have that data documented in the actual IEP present levels for transition. All right, so we spoke about agency involvement a little while ago. So we also want to make sure when we're talking about our transition present levels that we include a separate heading called agency involvement. We want to make sure that we have a statement about parental consent. The law states that agencies need to be invited. We talked about that on the actual IEP invite, but the law further states that we have to have parental consent. And we're going to show you an example of how we can do that. We need to make sure that we get the parental consent and that we also document what information was shared regarding that agency support. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So in our actual present levels, we're going to have our transition assessment from this year. our transition assessment from last year. We're going to say, taking all of this into consideration, we have our 3 goals: education and training, employment, independent living, and then we're going to take it a step further and add one more bullet point there: agency involvement. And this is where we list that agency involvement, where we list that parental consent, where we list what the actual agency discussed with the actual IEP team. So a sample would be, OVR was invited to Tina's IEP meeting with parental consent as documented by the IEP invite on October 13th, 2020. OVR was unable to attend the meeting, but the team discussed the benefits of opening a case. The Early Reach Initiative brochure was also given to Tina and her parents. Not only do we need to document the fact that we had this parental consent here, but we also have to give a takeaway. When you go into the actual IEP meeting, you're going to that IEP meeting with a draft document, okay? So the statement could just be as simple as this: OVR was invited with parental consent. We don't add this information here until after that IEP meeting. Remember, we don't know if the agency is going to be able to come. Sometimes the agency can support, sometimes they can't. If the agency is not there, we just have a statement like this: OVR was unable to come, but we gave them a takeaway. We talked about a brochure. We talked about a phone number. If OVR was able to come to the meeting, then you just simply say, OVR was able to attend the meeting, and we discussed this, this, and this. That's going to be your takeaway. But you always need to make sure that you have that agency statement there in your transition present levels. And in a moment, we're going to see what this totally looks like, all packaged with a bow on it. So let's take a look here. So transition present levels related to post-secondary transition, okay? This is Tina's 2nd year of transition services. On October 16th, she was given the PA Career Zone Transition Survey. We have the date, and we actually have what assessment was given. On the survey, Tina indicated she was interested in working some part of the beauty industry. It's not a whole lot of information, but at least we've summarized the data. That's okay. We take it a step further. We want to go 2 years, okay? On September 14th, 2017, she was given the following surveys and assessments. So we have the date, and we also have all of the surveys that she took. The interest survey, the keys to work, and we also did a student interview. Then we summarized all of the information that we talked about. The information up here was from the last year. This is the current information. So the current information is always going to be a little bit more, but we want to make sure that we talk about both of those assessments, and we want to summarize the data. We talked about what summarizing data looks like in our present level series last time, actually 2 times ago. Last time it was measure biannual goals, but we want to make sure that we always interpret that data. What does it actually look like, okay? Then we take it a step further and we say, taking this information into consideration, Tina's post-secondary goals have remained the same as last year and are as follows. We always want to make sure that we consider the goals from year to year, and then we just list those goals: post-secondary education and training. Tina has a goal of pursuing post-secondary education and training in the field of cosmetology and fashion upon graduation from high school. Then we talk about employment. Tina has a goal of obtaining employment in the field of cosmetology and fashion upon graduation from high school. Independent living, she has the goal of living independently upon high school graduation. And then we have that agency involvement, how we invited OVR. They were unable to attend the meeting, but we discussed Tina opening a case and we passed on that brochure, okay? So let's go back a slide here to sum everything up with the transition section. We want to talk about the assessment from last year, the assessment from this year. We want to summarize what those assessments look like. Then we take it a step further. We take everything into consideration and talk about how those goals either remain the same or they changed. Then we actually list all 3 of those goals: education and training, employment, and independent living. And then last but certainly not least, we want to make sure we list that agency involvement piece, tell that we had parental consent. Then we want to tell if the agency was actually able to come or if they weren't able to come. And you update this section here after you actually have the IEP meeting. When you're going into the IEP meeting, you're just going in with a statement like this here. After the IEP meeting, give us a takeaway. Talk about what exactly happened at that actual IEP meeting. All right, we're going to move on. We're on the home stretch, my friends. We're talking about our transition grid. And we want to make sure before we actually go into that transition grid, if you have a student that is in a career and technical education program, there is something called a CIP code, CIP. Okay, and that code, every single program in a CTE program has their own unique code that needs to be put in right before the transition grid. And what that looks like here is, for students, In career and technology centers, put the zip code here. This is what it looks like in our DART system. For those of you that use Starfall and Skyward and some of those other IEP writing systems, it's going to go right in this section as well. But you want to make sure that you're always getting that zip code for a student that is in CTE, and it pops right in this zip code area. Once you have that, then we go into the actual transition grid. And this is what the grid actually looks like completed. We're going to break this down in a few moments. There are actually 3 portions to that grid: education and training, employment, and independent living. This is an example of the post-secondary education and training goal. And the first thing you'll notice is that we always have a question here about yes, no. 9 times out of 10, it's always going to be yes. The only time it's going to be no is when you do not give that student a goal. And remember, the personal recommendation is always to give a student a post-secondary goal. And if the team decides not to, make sure you have data, and then you're going to check this no. Once you actually go into the grid, you just list the same goal that you listed in the present levels. Then you list your courses of study. Then you list your anticipated courses that the student's going to take next year. And then we're going to talk about services and activities. We always want to make sure that we break out our service with an asterisk. That helps it pop out a little bit. And then our activity is something that typically happens 1 time a year that the student's going to be able to do to help them reach those post-secondary goals. All of these services and activities always have a location, a frequency, a beginning date, a duration, and those beginning dates and durations are going to be the same as the IEP implementation date and towards the end of the IEP's duration there. And we always want to make sure that we list the people who are responsible, and that's always going to be somebody from the school district, the student, possibly the student's family as well. So again, this is what the actual grid completed looks like, and let's break that down here in the next few slides. So we talked about how we have 3 grids: education and training, employment, independent living. We list the goal there, we list the courses of study, the services, and those activities. So our post-secondary goals, these are going to be the same way that you listed them in the transition present levels. I always like to say copy and paste from the transition present levels into the grid. You don't want to retype that because you might retype it a little bit different, and we want those goals to match. And remember, all of these goals should occur after that unique phrase, after high school graduation. They're post, they're occurring after the student graduates. So this is an example of that post-secondary education and training goal. Upon high school graduation, Raina has a goal of attending college or university to pursue a career in the field of education. That's going to be what you list there, and remember, it's the same one that you list in the transition present levels. Taking it a step further, we're going to make sure that we answer yes or no. Remember, if that student has a goal, it's going to always be yes here. The only time you're checking no is if a student does not have a goal. Then we go into the courses of study. The courses of study are what we consider that coordinated set of activities that helps the student move from high school to their post-secondary goals. Those courses should be aligned with those post-secondary goals. So for example, if we have a student that says that they want to go to Harvard and they're not taking college level courses in high school, if they're not on that college level track, that's going to be out of compliance. So we want to make sure that they are realistic and aligned with what their post-secondary goals are going to do. If a student is going to a CTE program, we want to make sure that we list those as well. And the courses of study should reflect this year's courses, but also next year's projected or anticipated courses. It's okay if they don't exactly match up for next year, but we want to see that track of what the student's doing this year and what they might be doing next year. So to unpack that a little bit further, the courses of study go right in this section here, and this is how we list them. Biology, English 3, American History, Algebra 1, Art, and Design. Some students simply might have, an elective here, 9th grade elective, 12th grade elective, whatever it's going to look like there, that's okay. But the biggest deal is what we're doing currently needs to be here, and what we're projecting or anticipating for next year needs to be here. The idea here is that the IEP is always current. But remember, that IEP is good for 1 year's time. So if you have that IEP meeting, say in January, and from January until June, these are the courses that the student's going to take. But that IEP is still going to be valid come August. And these are the courses that the student's going to be doing in August. That way, if we check the IEP in August or September of next year, we still have current courses. That's why we list as projected, or you can use the term anticipated there as well. Then we're going to jump into services and activities. And these service and activities are those basic action steps that support the students' movements from where they're currently at towards those post-secondary goals. They should be occurring during the current IEP. These services and activities are current. They're not things that are going to occur next year and in 2 years. It has to be something that we're going to be doing during this current IEP. And each post-secondary goal area, remember in the grid, there's education and training, employment, independent living. We have to have at least one service. And again, a service is a measurable annual goal tied to that actual post-secondary goal. We also need to make sure that we have at least one activity that help the students reach that goal. These are all part of those coordinated set of activities. So if you have education and training, employment, independent living, and the student just has one behavior goal, that behavior goal is going to be listed for education and training, employment, and independent living. But if we have education and training, employment, and independent living, and say we have a reading, writing, and math goal, you need to be able to spread those reading, writing, and math goals throughout all three of these here. Some teachers choose to list all three, reading, writing, and math for education and training, reading, writing, and math for employment, reading, writing, and math for independent living. Other teachers might break it out where we have our reading goal that's going to be attached to our education and training goal, our writing goal that's going to be attached to our employment goal, or our reading, writing, and math. That's the last one. Math could be lined up for that independent living goal. However you choose to spread it out is okay, but we need to make sure that every single post-secondary goal, education and training, employment, independent living, has a service, and every single measurable annual goal, reading, writing, and math, are going to be represented there. It gets a little confusing, but you just need to make sure that those line up. That's called IEP alignment. And when we talk about our services, again, those are those measurable annual goals. A best practice here is to list it with an asterisk. And we're going to talk about an activity here in a few moments. That's what the student is going to do typically in 1 year's time as they get towards that post-secondary goal. So our services, remember, measurable annual goal. We want that in the action statement. If the goal is given a series of math problems, Jeff will solve those problems with 100% accuracy, blah, 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 blah. We don't want to make sure that we're going to list that actual goal. But what we do want to say is Jeff is going to increase his ability to solve math problems. We'd like to list those in action statements. We've talked about if we have 5 measurable annual goals, you're going to have 5 services. Each post-secondary goal needs a service. And we want to make sure this last bullet point here, our friends that do related services, our speech friends, our occupational therapy friends, our physical therapy friends, if they have a measurable annual goal, that goal needs to be represented as a service as well. Again, if you have 5 measurable annual goals, you're going to have 5 services spread out through the transition grid. If you have any questions in that, you shoot me an email and I'll be sure to help you out. It gets a little confusing, but we just want to make sure that they're always represented. Then we want to make sure that we talk about how we're putting these in those action statements there. And I spoke about what that looks like. You're not going to copy and paste the actual measurable annual goal. You're going to put it more action terms there, you know? So if it's going to be given a list of words, Jeff is going to increase his reading fluency. We're not going to copy and paste that whole goal. We're just going to say increase reading fluency there. That's how you represent those measurable annual goals as services. Taking it a step further, we have our activities here. And our activities typically occur maybe once, sometimes twice during the IEP term. These are all things that realistically we want that student to be able to do. It's not something that we think we're going to get them to do. It's something that we want them to be able to do. These events are going to help that student make progress towards those post-secondary goals. So if you want to pause this here and jot down some notes, these are some examples for some activities for post-secondary education and training. So that would be exploring a post-secondary program, going on a college fair, doing a virtual tour, seeing a guest speaker, visiting that college, contacting a college or university disability services office. These are all activities that are going to help that student get to that post-secondary education and training. When we look at employment, these would be all employment activities. They're doing some career exploration. They're going to visit that career and technical center. They're going to put together a career portfolio. They're going to get some real-world work experience. They're going to talk with OBR. Again, those are all things that we want to have the student do within your 1 year's time to get them towards employment. But make sure that you're putting things in here that are realistic. You don't need to list 5 or 6 activities for employment. Generally, 1 is okay, but whatever you list, you want to make sure that that student is actually going to most likely move towards in 1 year's time. And last but not least, we have our independent living piece here. So these are all examples of some activities, and that could be participating in a club, doing some shopping on their own, if they're doing some budgeting skills, working towards their driver's education there, voter registration. These are all things that you can list as activities to get that student towards their post-secondary independent living goals. So what does this look like in the grid? Remember, we're going to use an asterisk there when we're talking about our service. The asterisk just helps that pop out a little bit more as a service, and then the activities are listed here as well. So you list your service and your activity here. The next slide indicates what it looks like complete, because your service is also going to have a location, as well as your activity is going to have a location. Then your frequency, if it's an IEP goal, it's something most likely that they're going to work on daily. Say it's a speech goal, and that's going to be measured as a service here. Maybe speech gets up to 120 minutes a month, so the frequency would be up to 120 minutes per month here as well. It has to match. Those IEP goals that you're going to be delivered in the day-to-day setting, it's okay to put daily, but again, if it's speech, OT, PT, and they get that service weekly, it's okay to list that weekly, or sometimes we list that up to 120 minutes per month, as I said, but we want to make sure that that frequency matches. Check the frequency here quarterly for our activity. They talk about researching the 4-year college and university. Well, we want that student to do it, 4 times a year. That's okay. Sometimes this might just be once a year. That's okay too. But whatever you put in there, again, we want to make sure that student's going to be able to do within 1 year's time. We talked about the projected beginning date and the duration. If you're using the DARTS IEP writing system, those dates are already going to be populated for you, but we want to make sure that those are same dates as the IEP implementation and the duration. And then those people that are responsible, it's always going to be a representative from the school district, and it's always going to be either the student or sometimes the family as well. Notice this one here says about the parents, because the parents are going to help that student research those 4-year college and universities. But again, the IEP, as we talked about in the beginning, is a partnership, excuse me, between the school district and the family. So same deal when we're doing these services and activities, they should have people on both sides of the fence, the school district as well as the family. Those are the people that are responsible. All right. So this is what the grid looks like completed. You can pause this. You can take a snapshot of this. And then we're going to wrap things up here. We want to make sure that you visit this link here to download a copy of the PowerPoint and also some supporting documents. You can pause this and write that link down there. That's going to lead you to get to this presentation in a form that you can print out. And there are 2 documents. The first one here is a transition reminders document. That's just something that I put together for you that walks you through each step of the actual IEP, where you need to put some information. And I've also created for you an annotated transition IEP. It's not the whole IEP annotated, just specific what we need to transition pieces there. It really talks about our present levels, really talks about our measure annual goals. It also talks about our transition section and the transition grid. But if you go ahead to this link here and download these 2 documents here, in addition to watching this training and going through and printing out the supporting documents, you'll be set and you'll have a IEP there that is very compliant with what the state wants us to do, and also compliant with what we consider these best practices for secondary transition. I always like to wrap things up too with my Chipotle burrito. It's been some time during COVID here, so I haven't been able to have one of those, but I'm really looking forward to when all is said and done. So I always like to wrap things up there with a little joke for you, but we want to make sure that we understand that transition begins at age 14. And remember, if that student is going to turn 14 within the duration of the IEP, then we need to start transition at that time as well. Transition should always be based on a student's preferences and interests. We have to take into consideration what that student wants to actually do. If the student has unrealistic goals, we don't want to be that dream crusher. We want to use assessment to help them get to that piece and say, you know what, I did want to be able to do this for my goal, but this goal is more realistic, and thank you for showing me the way. That's why we need to be able to use assessment. In addition, we also want to make sure that we have agencies involved during this transition process. And speaking of assessment a couple minutes ago, we also want to make sure that we have our current year's assessment information, but also last year's assessment information as well. And finally, when we wrap things up in the grid, we want to make sure that we have our post-secondary goals, our services, our activities, and also our courses of studies. within those grids there. It's very, very crucial that we have all three. I really want to thank you for hanging in there with us today during this IEP Best Practice Series focusing on secondary transition. I have my email address here, jpele@iu17.org, and you can also give me a phone call at any time at 570-323-8561. I'm at extension 1007. I can't thank you enough. It's very fun doing these virtual trainings here. I know I talk fast, but it's just because I want to get you that information and get you on your way. But please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. I truly appreciate it, and we will be back next time, and we're going to talk about IEP alignment and that common thread that goes through the IEP, making sure that everything is aligned. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Take care now.